Jack Schabrowski here. Let's talk creativity. In marketing in particular, we often want our students to be creative. But then we have a hard time evaluating exactly what creativity is. I'm going to start this discussion by pointing out to all of you that you are all creative, some more confident in your creativity and some less confident. 3 pickup trucks: Rivian, Tesla, Ford. It's an interesting creativity exercise to think about, could we really produce something like an electric pickup truck that didn't rely on gasoline? We have done it with automobiles now. How about pickup trucks? Well, 3 different companies with 3 different sets of designers came up with 3 different looks and types of electric pickup trucks. Are you creative? Well, to be able to answer that question, first off, you need to know what creativity is. And do you have any proof that you are or are not creative? Creativity, of course, is the capability or act of conceiving something original or unusual and typically new. There are 3 components of creativity. There's a knowledge expertise component. All the relevant understanding an individual brings to bear on any creative effort is your knowledge and expertise. We all have different knowledges and expertise because we've all had different life experiences. The second part of creativity is creative thinking. This relates to how people approach problems, and it depends on your personality and your thinking and your working style, but also your personality and your experiences and your background and any education that you might have could influence how you approach problems. Motivation. Motivation is generally accepted as a key to creative production. And the most important motivators are the intrinsic passion and interest in the work itself. And this is especially true, I think, for people who work in areas where there are high levels of creativity expected, because coming up with new ideas is not easy. I have some quotes here, and I tried to have these ordered in a way that makes some sense to us all. Creativity is the quality that you bring to the activity that you are doing. It is an attitude, it's an inner approach, how you look at things. I have often been in problem solving sessions with people, and they come up with ideas that I don't think are very good. But the reason that those ideas don't look very good to me is because they really have a different way of looking at things than I do. And it's important for you to be tolerable and try to learn from how others are approaching new ideas. One of my favorite quotes about creativity is the Stone Age didn't end because they ran out of stones. It was a number of creative ideas and thoughts that moved the Stone Age onward. I then have an Alice in Wonderland quote. We talk about Alice in Wonderland quotes in terms of planning. Here's one in terms of creativity. There is no use trying, said Alice. One can't believe impossible things. I dare say you haven't had much practice, said the Queen. When I was your age, I always did it for at least a half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I'd believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. And so part of this quote is this notion of some people don't think they're creative and therefore they're not. Other people believe they are creative and therefore they are. So you have to be a little bit careful of this notion of self-fulfilling prophecy. That is, if you believe you're not, you won't be. And if you believe you are, you will be. Now, it doesn't mean that you're good at creating things. It just means that you are more willing to spend time thinking about and creating new things. My comment about creativity is I'm not creative. I'm a thinker that keeps coming up with good ideas. And so I don't think of creativity from a creativity standpoint. I think it's a byproduct of lots of other things. I shall become a master of this art only after a great deal of practice. You know the old story about it takes 10,000 hours to get good at something. Well, how do you get good at being creative? I'm not so sure you necessarily work at it, but you ought to practice it more often. You ought to try to think more creatively about solutions to problems and ways of doing things. Another one of my quotes is, the more I try to solve unusual problems, the more creative I become. Once again, the more you practice being creative, the more you put yourself into situations where you need to be creative, the more likely you are to become better at being creative. As competition intensifies, the need for creative thinking increases. It is no longer enough to do the same thing better, no longer enough to be efficient and solve problems. You need to be creative. All companies love creative workers until something happens that costs the firm money. Listen to anyone with an original idea, no matter how absurd it may sound at first. If you put fences around people, you get sheep. Give people the room they need to be creative. This is William McKnight, 3M president, and of course you're familiar with 3M, the 3M company. It is considered to be one of the original bastions of creative business thinking. John Steinbeck, famous author, ideas are like rabbits. You get a couple of them and you learn how to handle them, and pretty soon you have a dozen. Of course, John is talking about creative ideas from an author's standpoint. We all think it's easier in some other field to be creative than ours. That's not true. How about Albert Einstein? Creativity is contagious. Pass it on. The principal goal of education is to create people who are capable of doing new things, not simply of repeating what other generations have done. People who are creative, inventive, and discoverers. While we say that, that isn't necessarily how our education system works, but it's a wonderful thought. The creative person is willing to live with ambiguity. He or she doesn't need problem solved immediately and can afford to wait for the right ideas. I think that's the sort of a humorous quote, but it is the sort of notion that sometimes you can be very creative in an area and really not come up with anything that is going to be worthwhile to try to innovate or implement. Can you teach someone to be creative? Think about that for a second. Can I teach you to be more creative? Probably not. You probably, being creative is not really teaching you to be creative is not really what we specialize in education, and there's not lots and lots of examples of success in teaching people to be creative. One of the biggest problems with teaching people to be creative is that we have inherently uncreative people teaching you how to be creative. Think about the creative exercises that you have done while you've been in school. Were those done by really creative people, or were they simply doing the same things over and over again in your classes that they learned to do when they were in classes as students to demonstrate and to get you to be more creative? What kinds of creativity programs actually work? Well, ask yourself this. What kinds of creative exercises have you been exposed to? Do you think they really made you more creative? Do you think it's those exercises that made you more creative? Once again, some food for thought. Let's think creatively about creativity. It's important to note that nearly all creative techniques are not going to turn the average person into a young Einstein or Picasso. Everyone tends to accept the thought that you can't teach genius creativity. I think it's more about all those other things that influence creativity other than simply creative techniques. It's more about encouraging day-to-day creative thinking that can make students and adult workforce more productive. We sometimes it's referred to as creativity with a little c, and it's the notion that all people possess creative imagination building talents, and all we really have to do is see if we can't get you to exercise that skill set a little more often. Now, I have a couple of other little things to think about in terms of creativity. When we think about creativity in a new product environment, we're really talking about managed creativity. And so managed creativity is more successful if we assign much of the task to people with strong creative capabilities. It's a quote by Merle Crawford. And my response to that is, really? So if I ask you, do you have strong creative capabilities? How would you know that? How would you measure that? I don't think you can say that we have to find people with strong creative capabilities because, and oftentimes, and at least my exposure to this has been that people who are full of what I would refer to as random neuron firings in terms of things that they think and do. Um, we think that they're creative when in reality they're not creative. They're just random thinkers. The problem with new idea generation in organizations is that what works for one firm usually doesn't work for others, and what works for one person doesn't usually work for others. We're going to talk about things that each of us should realize help us with creativity and don't help us with creativity. That is some things that we should use to help trigger our own creative juices. Of course, the idea of creativity is the capability or act of conceiving something original or unusual, and I like to add, and typically new. Like most human qualities, creativity evidences itself in our ability to solve challenges or problems with novel solutions and ideas. And so, if you think this way, the way to identify the people who are most creative is based on their accomplishments, not on whether or not they think they're creative. Some people do a lot of random thinking, but they're not creative. I'm going to tell you a little story now, and this is a story that I like to tell, and it's a story about creativity and the fact that school sometimes tries to stifle that. When I was in high school, we didn't have AP courses. Instead, I was an honors math student. That is, I had honors math classes. And in those math classes, the best mathematical students in each grade would be in that class. I was in a high school with about 2,500 students, and so we had a relatively large group of kids to pick from. My graduating class had 500 students in it. This math class was always full of smart kids, and we were very competitive. When we were juniors, we started participating in something called the Mathematical Association of America's National Math Competition. We would take the test, and I say it was in January, but it might have been in November, and the results came back sometime in the spring. My score was something like 33. It was the second highest score in the whole high school and among the top 5% nationally for people in my age group. Everyone celebrated, especially me. Later in the spring semester, the test was released along with the solutions. The test was a multiple choice test, but it had very clever wrong answers that would be easy to get to if you just approached the problem from the wrong direction or in the wrong way. As a learning experience, we went over that test in class. And for every question that was on the test, the teacher asked if anyone had tried to solve each question. If someone raised their hand that they had tried to solve it and got it right, then they were asked to go to the blackboard and show how they solved the problem. At some point, there were questions that a question where I was the only person to get the correct answer of all the people that took it at our school. Since it was a relatively difficult problem, it had a relatively high point value, and it certainly propelled me from being fourth or fifth best to second best. I was asked to go to the blackboard and replicate my answer, so I did. It was a rather complicated problem, and it took a multitude of steps to solve it, and basically the three parts of the blackboard in the front of the room were all filled with formulas and those sorts of things to solve the problem. When I finished my ciphering, I ended up with the solution. 3.4, answer D, the correct answer. Everyone applauded except for the teacher. And the teacher was Mr. Frost, and he's a nice guy. He went to a local university and was now teaching high school math. And a bright enough guy and a pleasant enough person. After he looked at the solution presented by me or in the answer key, and then he looked at my solution, they weren't the same. So he commented that my approach did not match the answer key and that I was simply lucky to accidentally end up with the right answer, implying that my high score was a fluke. That happened nearly 55 years ago, but I never forgot the incident. I was a little embarrassed that he had suggested that I had by luck been the second best score on the whole high school. But to this day, I absolutely believe that I simply found a different way to get to the answer, and it wasn't luck. Seldom is there only one way to solve any problem. And I know that the way I solved the problem was one of the right ways. After all, I am creative, if nothing else. And so I like to tell that story because while it upset me some at the time, it doesn't upset me as much now. And I realize that the reason that the teacher didn't see my answer as being correct is because they had an answer key in front of them. There wasn't one part of my ciphering that was inaccurate, was a mistake or inappropriate. But he just assumed, since my order of ciphering didn't match the one on the answer key, that mine couldn't have possibly also been right. There's a big difference, by the way, between eccentric people, creative people, and those capable of generating new product ideas. And I talk about generating new product ideas as goal-directed creativity. The best way to identify creative people is to look at their track record. Activities to encourage creativity. This is typically in an organization. All right, in an organization, what kinds of things can an organization do to encourage creativity? Well, first off, to be accommodative, and that is to accommodate whatever it takes for people to be creative. Is it the way their offices are set up? Is it team building activities? What is it that helps them to become more creativity? It helps if you have a creative boss who understands the concept of creativity. It helps if the environment is one like 3M where there are no right answers. Another is a little anarchy is good. When I coached college football, I coached at one point in time. I coached for a guy by the name of Vince McMahon, and Vince used to always evaluate the team before the season started in whether or not there were any. I wouldn't say troublemakers. We used to say that they were heck raisers, that people who raised a little heck on the team, because he always felt like to have a really good football team, you had to have some people who were not just regular people. They had to have some people who were alpha males who in fact had a little edge to them and a little anarchy to them, because that's what really made a good football team. Not a lot, but some anarchy. Uh, um, New problem and problem solving teams. One of the ways that I got to be good at creative problem solving was when my very first job we had a lot of inter-office competitions where we would pick teams and try to come up with new ideas and for Westclox to be more effective, more efficient, or produce higher quality products. And each of those competitions would result in um, a financial reward for the people who came up with the best ideas. And so I always tried to be on Eddie Schlossick's team because Eddie was the head of engineering, and he was a bright guy. He graduated from the with I think maybe a master's in engineering from the University of Illinois. Bright guy, and he could come up with new ideas sort of at will. And so I always tried to be on his team because I was never on his team in any of those competitions where we didn't make some money. And in some cases, it was pretty good money. In a couple of cases, it was 25% of my annual salary for the winners. And 25% of your annual salary, that's a pretty good pop. Um, to be creative, I think you have to have some free time. And I think you have to be familiar with some of the creativity based techniques, like the Phillips 66 groups, or brainstorming circles, or reverse brainstorming, or teardown, or what we sometimes refer to as reverse engineering. All examples of being exposed to different techniques to encourage creativity. For me, creativity is inherently an individual process. Sometimes it can be a twosome, but seldom is it a group project. But others disagree, and I have a site here for people who disagree with that point of view. Um, I think that creativity is about making non-obvious connections. So I want you to think about that. I believe that part of creativity, not all of it, but part of creativity is about making non-obvious connections. And I believe that dealing with big data or any data requires creativity. And I want you to think about this. I tell students that one of the skills that all professional marketers have to have today is they need to be able to run the numbers. They need to be able to understand the story that the numbers are trying to tell them. And to do that, I think takes creativity. So as we move forward now into new product development and other marketing activities, remember, you are creative. Maybe you don't realize it, but you are.